I'm Leanna Sanders. I'm the therapist at the St. Louis Arc. I started my journey with disability cert work whenever I started at Giant Step School for Autism in 2016. And while I was there, I was getting my master's in social work. And I realized as I was working with the students there, a lot of times they had not been able to process trauma. So I really wanted to focus on that and eventually do therapy with people who have disabilities and trauma. It's one of the highest populations that experience trauma and stress. So I thought that was really important to make therapy accessible for people with disabilities. I did my practicum at the St. Louis Arc about 7 years ago and ended up working there and staying there in a multitude of different jobs, helping families and individuals with disabilities, and now doing full time therapy. So, really working with people who've experienced traumatic experiences, life transitions, grief support, all kinds of stuff. And then Sue and I do mental health first aid training, specifically focusing on people with disabilities. So if anybody ever wants to do those trainings, we do offer those.
And my name is Sue Shaw. I have been in the field supporting people with disabilities for about 36 years and started out moving some people out of habilitation centers, and we were told that any behavior would go away when we did that, which didn't happen. So I learned a lot of things very quickly. And then in 2016, had a young man that my son asked me to, he didn't have a place to stay. And so asked me to support him. And he does not have a disability, but I was seeing things from him, like he was putting people in headlocks, he was screaming, he was punching walls. And it really made me start questioning that we had always said that a lot of the things that we saw and labeled as behavior from people that we supported with disabilities were things I was seeing with him, and that it was a lot more trauma based. I'm not saying that disability doesn't carry some different things, but a lot of what I was seeing was reactions to trauma. And then I started really questioning what that looks like with people with disabilities as well. So I went back and started studying trauma. And as this young man healed, I've had 8 more young adults in my home since. So I've learned a lot on both ends about trauma, and then started presenting about that. I guess that's been probably 2022. And we've moved forward since then. So we have a video here, and this is just the basic definition of what trauma is. This is Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. He does a lot of training about trauma. One of the books he wrote is The Body Keeps the Score, that looks at how your body remembers trauma that you've experienced. So I'm going to go ahead and play this because it'll give us a good basis for what trauma is.
Most important thing to know is that there's a difference between trauma and stress. As I like to say to people, life sucks a good amount of the time. We all have jobs and situations that are really unpleasant. But the moment that the situation is over, it's over. The problem with trauma is that when it's over, your body continues to relive it. My name is Bessel van der Kolk. I'm a psychiatrist, neuroscientist, and author of the book, The Body Keeps the Score. I got interested in trauma on my first day working at the Veterans Administration. 1978 was the year, and the Vietnam War was over by about 6 or 7 years. The very first day that I met Vietnam veterans, I was just blown away. These were guys who were my age, who were clearly smart and competent and athletic, and they clearly were just a shadow of their former self. But their bodies were clearly affected by trauma, and they had a very hard time connecting with new people after the war. Around that time, a group of us started to define what trauma is. And in the definition of PTSD, we write, these people have been exposed to an extraordinary event that's outside of normal human experience. And in retrospect, that shows us how ignorant and narrow-minded we were. Because it turned out that this is not an unusual experience at all. People usually think about the military when they talk about trauma. But at least 1 out of 8 kids in America witness physical violence between their parents. A larger number of kids get beaten very hard by their own caregivers. A very large number of people in general, but women in particular, have sexual experiences that were clearly unwanted and that left them confused and enraged. So, unlike what we first thought, trauma is actually extremely common. There's a lot of debate of what a trauma is to this day. But basically, trauma is something that happens to you that makes you so upset that it overwhelms you. There is nothing you can do to stave off the inevitable. You basically collapse in a state of confusion, maybe rage, because you are unable to function in the face of this particular threat. But the trauma is not the event that happens, the trauma is how you respond to it. One of the largest mitigating factors against getting traumatized is who is there for you at that particular time. When, as a kid, you get bitten by a dog, it's really very scary and very nasty. But if your parents pick you up and say, oh, I see that you're really in bad shape, let me help you. That dog bite doesn't become a big issue because the foundation of your safety has not been destroyed. We are profoundly interdependent people. And as long as our relationships are intact, by and large, we're pretty good with trauma. It's a subjective experience, and what may be traumatic for you may not be traumatic for me, depending on our personality and our prior experiences. The problem with trauma is that it starts off with something that happens to us, but that's not where it stops, because it changes your brain. Much of the imprint of trauma is in a very primitive survival part of your brain that I like to call the cockroach brain. There's a part of you that just picks up what's dangerous, what's safe. And when you're traumatized, that little part of your brain, which is usually very quiet, continues to just send messages. I'm in danger. I'm not safe. That event itself is over, but you continue to react to things as if you're in danger. We're talking about survival. We're talking about staying alive. And so some people go into fight flight, or on a more primitive level, people's brain shuts down and they collapse. You have these automatic responses that are not a product of your cognitive assessment, they're a product of your animal brain trying to stay alive in the face of something that part of your brain interprets as a life threat. And the problem then becomes that you are not able to engage or to learn or to see other people's point of view or to coordinate your feelings with your thinking. Traumatized people have a tremendous problem experiencing pleasure and joy. But the core issue is our hormones and our physiological impulses that have to do with survival. Your body keeps mobilizing itself to fight. You have all kinds of immunological abnormalities, endocrine abnormalities, and that really devastates your physical health also. Oftentimes, the physical problems are longer lasting than the mental problems. The other thing that is terribly important is the impact of poverty, or the impact of racism, or the impact of unemployment. There's other societies that are much more trauma savvy than we are, where there is not an enormous amount of income inequality. Healthcare is universal, childcare is universal. A culture like that really looks at what are the antecedents for certain forms of pathology. So the big issue is a political issue. How do we rearrange our society to really know about trauma so that people who grow up under extreme adverse conditions can become full-fledged members of society?
All right. I do want to think about too for a minute that people with disabilities are probably even more apt to have experienced trauma, whether it's because they've been told to be quiet and listen and do what people say, or because people don't believe what they say. So it is something that is definitely probably 80 to 90% of people who have disabilities have experienced some sort of trauma, and often that's childhood, but not always. That can also happen in 24-hour supports and other settings. All right, so this next slide, we're looking at what is safe. It's definitely something that all of us have a little bit different definition of. Think about what is safe to you. And I hear a lot of people say being comfortable. Leanna, what do you think of when you think of safe?
I think of being in my routine and having my dogs around me.
Okay.
I think we can also look back at this tornado that we had happen on Friday. That really kind of dispersed everybody's safety nets. So really thinking about those protective factors that we have when we're in a crisis. So that could be family, that could be, I consider my pets a protective factor, a good workplace, family members, friends that will help. So anything that's safe and a protective factor for you can definitely include that.
Yeah. And I've got my phone right here. That's something that's safe for me because I know that if I have my phone and I haven't heard anything from my family, that tells me that they're safe. And so I don't have to worry about them. So that is definitely a safety thing for me. So the definition varies very much according to the person. And so as we're thinking about that, if I took a box of what was safe for me and gave it to you, wouldn't necessarily meet the need, right? Because I don't have dogs. So we've got to think some of those things through. What does safety look like? And we found that things like we send a child off to a new school with their iPad and mom's phone number's in that iPad and they hold on to it very tight. And maybe the teacher says, wow, they love that iPad. Let's make it the reinforcer. And when we take the iPad away, we see that behavior increase because that child isn't safe anymore. Or I had a young man stay with me who, when he was out in public, he was either holding on to me or he was wearing his leather coat, even if it was August, because he needed that safety. He had been labor trafficked and he just needed to feel safe when he was out and about. So it very much varies according to that. And one of the things that we're seeing, and we see it with our staff sometimes, is how can we be both safe and brave? So we've got a staff person who maybe doesn't feel safe around a certain situation, or they've lived through some trauma themselves. And by the way, a high percentage of our staff have also experienced trauma, probably about 70% walking in, because they're caregivers. They want to make people better. They want to improve things. So a lot of them have experienced trauma as well. And so we put them in a situation where they don't feel completely safe. And we can't always move them around very quickly, but one thing we can do is help them look at, okay, you need to be safe, but how can we be safe and brave? And how can we give you the supports you need so that you can be brave in this situation and work through this situation? And I think that happens a lot, again, with people with disabilities being thrown into situations in school or whatever. Some of them are not going to be safe and we're going to have to move them or help them. But some of them, it's also being safe and brave. And we'll talk about a few of those things as we go through as well.
Post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD, This can happen in not just veterans, but anybody who has experienced a traumatic event. It's whenever we do struggle to recover from it. The symptoms include avoidance of tasks associated with a traumatic event, feelings of irritability, navigating beliefs about yourself, and having trouble sleeping. A lot of times, whenever we do not get immediate help, we do tend to see these escalate about 6 months later. So it can be really good to get that immediate help and make sure that you are seeing a mental health therapist. Post-traumatic stress disorder, a lot of times people might not think that they have it. They might realize, I was talking to a good friend the other day and she mentioned, my dad died and I haven't been able to sleep. So that's a sign that she went through a traumatic event with her dad. And a lot of times the people that we support, it might look a little bit different. So we might see heightened behaviors. I worked with somebody who had a traumatic event happen inside her house, and about 9 months later, she stopped sleeping at night. So, and having a lot of behaviors while she was at day program. So really struggling to get through the day and doing activities that she didn't necessarily enjoy. A lot of times in the disability community, when people start having behaviors like that, which really is just asking for a need to be met, people tend to say they're having behaviors, they're having attention-seeking behaviors, which is not typically the case. We really want to pay attention to what has happened in their past and take that into account and see what we can do for them to help them feel safe and have those protective factors and feel like they can be brave in an environment that might be new to them. And then we have CPTSD, which is also known as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. This is when you experience trauma continuously. So that might happen in somebody in a childhood home where they have continuous abuse in the household. If somebody continuously has gotten in car accidents a lot, that could happen too. A lot of the symptoms include difficulty regulating emotions, having heightened emotions, nightmares or having flashbacks, difficulty connecting with people, physical symptoms such as a headache, stomachache, and chest pains, and regular suicidal thoughts and feelings. So a lot of times, if we're not taking into account this person's past, some people might get diagnosed with bipolar. ADHD is a pretty high diagnosis in women who are experiencing these symptoms. Borderline can also get diagnosed, but that I would definitely recommend speaking to a psychiatrist or psychologist who specializes in that, because that can get diagnosed via trauma or via personality diagnosis. So that can be kind of a difficult diagnosis as well. CPTSD definitely needs mental health support. So a lot of times I recommend EMDR for patients who are going through CPTSD. It's actually really accessible for people with disabilities. You're able to think about your safe spaces and think through what you find safe, and then be able to be in a safe environment and think through the traumatic event. So there are a lot of specialists out there that are able to help with that. It helps you process that emotion whenever you are feeling like you're having a flashback. So it helps you process it in a different way in safe environment. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder can be really life altering. So thinking about those symptoms, it can be controlling of your life, especially if you don't realize that you've had it, or if you are living in that environment and you had continuous trauma growing up. It's always good to think about these symptoms. And I always recommend mental health support. I think that can be really helpful, even if you feel like you haven't had an event happen recently. It can definitely help you talk through that.
I've also noticed that somebody who may experience complex PTSD as a child and then work through a lot of it, and then another traumatic experience happens, that can be very, very difficult. People with or without disabilities, it usually takes quite a while to work through it. So if something else does happen, getting somebody support quickly is really important after another traumatic event afterwards.
It kind of brings them back to what happened originally. A lot of times people, thank you, Sue, this is reminding me of another point I wanted to make. A lot of times people with disabilities will have that new traumatic event happen, but they might talk about the past one. And that's how they're relating it to how they've been feeling. So that's typically how somebody might talk about it. If they don't have the words, talk about the current event that just happened. So thank you, Sue.
And we're seeing some of that come up now, especially for people that go to like R&R camp, or some of our like transition dorm stays, that kind of thing, where you make a new friend really quickly, and you're telling them about your life. And sometimes we're hearing historical trauma come up in those settings. And so we do make sure now that if that happens, we will let you know, and we will also probably have recommend that you follow up with a counselor, just because it's coming up. It means that they're thinking about it again.
And then who experiences PTSD? So it just doesn't happen to veterans. It can happen to anyone who has experienced a traumatic event. And kind of like what the video was saying, it's all relative. It all depends on our personality. Some people might experience something and think that wasn't traumatic, but another person will. So that's definitely something to think about. A lot of times, people with disabilities might say something's really scary, and people working with them might say, no, it's not, you're fine. So, really thinking about relative experience. It could be scary for someone else. I'm terrified of heights. I hate roller coasters, but that would be a traumatic experience for me, where somebody else might really enjoy that stuff. So that's kind of a baby version of PTSD, but a very basic example of how trauma can be very relative to what you've experienced in your personality and how you're able to take in information. A lot of times, if somebody does have a processing disorder, it might take them a little bit of time to process what happened, and then the trauma might hit them. Or on the other hand, things might seem more traumatic right up front. So just depending on if they knew what was going on, if they understood a schedule, and if they were given plenty of time to know what to expect.
So I've already kind of shared these. 80 to 90% of people with disabilities have or will experience trauma in their lifetime. Sometimes it's because they can't communicate, or they don't know, understand what's going on. Sometimes it's because they're in situations where they're bullied in school. There's just a lot of different reasons why that might happen. About 70% of those in helping professions experience trauma before they started a job working with people with disabilities. They want to help. And then once we have staff working, 85% will experience secondary traumatic stress, vicarious trauma from hearing stories of the people they're supporting, from maybe getting hit or kicked or spit at, something like that, for working too much and just getting overwhelmed. So we do teach our staff to really take care of themselves. Vicarious trauma is when there's a personality change. So it gets to the point, and staff can have PTSD from not getting help as they've experienced secondary traumatic stress. So we're constantly helping staff to look at that, and how do we support each other, and how do you stay in a place where you can be healthy enough to support other people. And then also high rates of traumatic symptoms. We also see moral injury with our staff, which is when somebody is asked to do something that's against their morals. Maybe we've got a staff person who's not performing well, but we know if we let them go, they won't have a place to live. Or they think that they're at the home, and they think maybe a day program is abusive, but it's been reported and it's been found fine, but they still believe that. And so there's a lot of guilt there. So those are things that we also see with some of our staff.
So traumatic stress responses, we have fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. So a lot of times whenever our nervous system is activated, especially in a traumatic event, that goes into our fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Fawn is kind of a new one, as of probably like 10 years ago, but our brain immediately goes into, I'm in danger, I need to run. So that's flight. Fight is automatically like if somebody immediately gets really angry and starts hitting. Freeze, I feel like I got that with with the tornado stuff. My house ended up getting some damage to it, and I froze. I didn't know what to do. I was going blank. Thankfully, I had some lovely neighbors to help me. And fawn, a lot of times people, especially like if they grew up with an abusive parent, so they might fawn over the parent to try to kind of be the favorite and get a nicer side of the parent. So a lot of times if somebody feels anxious around someone or like they might be traumatized by them, they might give them compliments a lot. Talk really highly about them to them. So there's a lot of different reactions that might be happening. And this is not just in the moment, but also long term. So we want to think about that complex post traumatic stress disorder as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So with fawning, a lot of times when that person then grows up, they've been trying to please somebody so much that they don't know who they are. And so they struggle with, what is my identity? What do I want to be? What do I want to do? And they also struggle with being themselves around different people. They try to adapt themselves to whatever anybody that they meet wants. So that's been something else that recovery from that is figuring out who you are. And a lot of times that involves counseling, therapy, that kind of thing as well. Yeah, I like to think about these stress responses as a dragon flew in the room, and what would you do? And, do you hide under the desk? Do you run? And then the freeze, if a dragon is right there in my face, my brain's going to shut down. It's not going to make memories. So, I may remember a golden eye and it smelled like smoke, and that may be all that my memory gives me. And so then, something happens and the police say, well, what happened? And somebody who froze, there was a golden eye and it smelled like smoke. That's all I got. And then the police say, well, it must not have really happened. So do really be aware that if somebody's giving you that kind of information, it's probably that they froze. And then if it happened more than once, they may say, well, their story's not consistent. Well, yeah, it may have happened more than once and they have very limited memory from several different times, and it may not look like it's a consistent memory. So epigenetics is something that we see with trauma, and that's how the body reacts to trauma. It used to be early on with trauma, we thought DNA changed, and it doesn't. But what does happen is that somebody reacts to trauma, and whatever the weaknesses in their genes is kind of what comes out. So we may see somebody, my family carries diabetes is something that's very prominent in my family. So if you're under a lot of stress, if you're dealing with trauma, it's more likely that that's what would maybe come out for me. Fibromyalgia is something you might see. Arthritis.
A lot of autoimmune
Yes.
disorders happen. Then also with trauma, so when you experience a traumatic event, it doesn't change your DNA when that happens, kind of like what Sue was saying. But let's say, like when your great grandmother was pregnant and she was in an abusive relationship, that cortisol level that she's experiencing, because that gets really high when we're stressed and people get really sick and their immune systems break down, those types of genetics can get passed down. So that's why it's so hard for people to break those cycles of trauma within families. It's kind of bred into them, which is really hard. And people go to therapy and do a lot of work to try to break those cycles, just because that is what they're used to. So, but again, it does not change whenever you experience the traumatic event itself. It's more passing down.
Yeah. And you may see different things that affect, so if you're living in a food desert, your diet's not going to be so great. And that's going to affect everything. If you're working 80 hours a week, you're probably not going to get good exercise. So all of these things can contribute. Other things that, toxic chemicals or, lots of different things. Therapeutic drugs, some of them help the symptoms of one thing, but they also cause issues in another way. Alternative medicines, we don't even necessarily know yet what they're causing. Social interactions can be really good. We need 3 to 11 positives for every negative. So honestly, if somebody's experiencing trauma, but they have a close relationship with somebody, I supported somebody from Jamaica who the story she told, I was amazed. And she was fine. she really wasn't experiencing trauma, and it was because she was really close to her mom, really close to her brothers. They were very positive with her. She was getting those 3 or 4 positives for every negative, and she was pretty stable and pretty solid. But if you're getting only the negatives, if you're feeling like people are betraying you, or you're not supported by people, or you don't have that connection, that can also make the trauma worse. And then your microbiome, it's interesting because the plaque on your teeth is connected to your heart, and your gut biome is attached to your brain and mental illness. And if somebody's experienced trauma, then chance of mental illness goes up by about 40%. So we do tend to silo. We say, oh, they need disability services, but probably they've also experienced trauma, and we don't do so well in supporting somebody through trauma or through mental illness, which is increased, or culture. There's all these silos, and we need to start taking all those pieces and looking at the whole person so that we can treat them effectively.